Yo，大家好。
大家好。
今日我哋繼續咧陪你讀啦，讀你聽啦。咁啊，我哋讀咩咧？就係、Dickens 嘅 Great Expectations 啦，係咪？遠大前程啦。咁我哋嘅故事發展去到邊度啊？
去到pip 佢喺嗰個有錢人嗰度翻嚟啦。之後佢家姐親朋戚友喺度問佢哋點啊咁啊。之後佢講大話，講好多大話。之後後來講完之後，佢又同翻阿 Jo 講話，其實我講大話。係。
咁阿 Jo 喺度點樣反應？
唔想佢講大話啦。
係啊，係。咁然之後 pip 聽完阿 Jo 咁講，佢又點樣諗？
唔知喎。
其實阿 pip 呢一刻個反應其實係作者寫得幾深刻嘅，即係話佢其實都開始偏離咗阿 Jo 嗰啲教誨，即係佢開始睇到哦，原來有人係咁樣睇我哋嘅，即係外人係點樣睇我哋嘅，我哋就係一啲工人階級，即係你呢啲咁樣嘅道德觀念啊，要講真話啊，要做好人啊，呢啲嘢。即係你嘅諗法嚟嘅啫，唔係啲咩聖經必須要遵守嘅嘢嚟嘅，即係開始有呢啲思想啦。
眼界唔同咗。
開始眼界唔同咗，但係佢嘅眼界係來自邊度？只不過係人哋嘅説話啫，佢自己冇呢個眼界㗎，但係人哋嘅口中佢就得到咗呢樣。係。OK， 而呢啲説話都係負面嘅説話，所以難免會令到阿 pip 有一種即係失去咗自信啊、自卑啊咁，即係好容易會衍生啲負面嘅感情出嚟咯。咁睇下阿 pip 繼續發展落去喺老婆婆屋企，會繼續同個 Estella 發生啲咩關係啦，發生啲咩互動啦，好嘛？繼續到啦。The felicitous idea occurred to me a morning or two later when I woke, that the best step I could take towards making myself uncommon was to get out of Biddy everything she knew. 即係其實佢就係想令到自己唔好咁平凡。可能為咗討好啊 Estella 都唔出奇。In pursuance of this luminous conception, I mentioned to Biddy, when I went to Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's at night, that I had a particular reason for wishing to get on in life, and that I should feel very much obliged to her if she would impart all her learning to me. 但係呢個 Biddy 係邊個呢？我唔知啊。你睇下呢個 Biddy 係咩先？ Biddy, who was the most obliging of girls, immediately said she would.And indeed began to carry out her promise within 5 minutes. 即係佢而家就嗌呢個 Biddy 就叫佢教佢點樣先可以做上等人。The educational scheme or course established by Mr. Wopsle's great aunt may be resolved into the following synopsis. The pupils ate apples and put straws down one another's backs until Mr. Wopsle's great aunt collected her energies.And made an indiscriminate totter at them with a birch rod. After receiving the charge with every mark of derision, the pupils formed in line and buzzingly passed a ragged book from hand to hand. The book had an alphabet in it, some figures and tables, and a little spelling. That is to say, it had once. As soon as this volume began to circulate, Mr. Wopsle's great aunt fell into a state of coma,arising either from sleep or rheumatic paroxysm. The pupils then entered among themselves upon a competitive examination on the subjects of boots, with the view of ascertaining who could tread the hardest upon those toes. This mental exercise lasted until Biddy made a rush at them and distributed 3 defaced Bibles, more legibly printed at the best than any curiosities of literature I have since met with, speckled all over with iron mold, and having various specimens of the insect world smashed between their leaves. This part of the course was usually lightened by several single combats between Biddy and refractory students. When the fights were over, Biddy gave out the number of a page, and then we all read aloud what we could or what we couldn't in a frightful chorus. Biddy leading with a high, shrill, monotonous voice, and none of us having the least notion of or reference for what we were reading about. When this horrible din had lasted a certain time, it mechanically awoke Mr. Wopsle's great aunt, who staggered at a boy fortuitously and pulled his ears. This was understood to terminate the course for the evening, and we emerged into the air with shrieks of intellectual victory. It is fair to remark that there was no prohibition against any pupil's entertaining himself with a slate or even with the ink, but that it was not easy to pursue that branch of study in the winter season, on account of the little general shop in which the classes were holden, and which was also Mr. Wopsle's great aunt's sitting room and bedchamber, being but faintly illuminated through the agency of one low-spirited dip candle and no snuffers. 哇，寫得真係好古老，即係佢哋喺度搞啲咁嘅特訓班啊喺度，都唔係特訓班嘅，即係同呢個老女人呢個 Mr. Wopsle's great aunt 係咪就係呢個 Havisham 咧？定係邊個？應該係啦，係嘛？唔知。咁啊喺佢面前就喺度做啲咁嘅嘢。做啲咩就係喺度傳書啊，喺度讀字啊，喺度做咩？跟住喺度食蘋果啊，跟住就將嗰啲稻草擺落去其他人嗰啲 backpack 度啊咁樣，好奇怪。It appeared to me that it would take time to become uncommon， 即係佢哋以為做呢啲嘢就會特別啲啊。Under these circumstances, nevertheless, I resolved to try it, and that very evening Biddy entered on our special agreement by imparting some information from her little catalogue of prices under the head of moist sugar, and lending me, to copy at home, a large old English D which she had imitated from the heading of some newspaper, and which I supposed, until she told me what it was, to be a design for a buckle. Of course, there was a public house in the village, and of course Joe liked sometimes to smoke his pipe there. 即係我諗類似又唔係 bar 嘅 common house 啊，佢哋叫 public house。public house 係咪即係 bar？唔知。I had received strict orders from my sister to call for him at the Three Jolly Bargemen that evening on my way from school, and bring him home at my peril. To the Three Jolly Bargemen, therefore, I directed my steps. Three Jolly Bargemen 聽落個名似係啲酒吧名。There was a bar at the Jolly Bargemen, with some alarmingly long chalk scores in it on the wall at the side of the door, which seemed to me to be never paid off. 即係嗰啲人啲走數咁啊，寫低喺個 chalk 嗰度。They had been there ever since I could remember, and had grown more than I had. But there was a quantity of chalk about our country, and perhaps the people neglected no opportunity of turning it to account. It being Saturday night, I found the landlord looking rather grimly at these records. But as my business was with Joe and not with him, I merely wished him good evening, and passed into the common room at the end of the passage, where there was a bright large kitchen fire, and where Joe was smoking his pipe in company with Mr. Wopsle and a stranger. Joe greeted me as usual with, "Helloa, Pip, old chap," and the moment he said that, the stranger turned his head and looked at me. He was a secret-looking man whom I had never seen before. His head was all on one side, and one of his eyes was half shut up, as if he were taking aim at something with an invisible gun. He had a pipe in his mouth, and he took it out, and after slowly blowing all his smoke away and looking hard at me all the time, nodded. So I nodded, and then he nodded again, and made room on the settle beside him that I might sit down there. But as I was used to sit beside Joe whenever I entered that place of resort, I said, "No, thank you, sir," and fell into the space Joe made for me on the opposite settle. The strange man, after glancing at Joe and seeing that his attention was otherwise engaged, nodded to me again when I had taken my seat, and then rubbed his leg in a very odd way, as it struck me. "You were saying," said the strange man, turning to Joe, "that you was a blacksmith." "Yes, I said it, said Joe. "What will you drink, mister?" He didn't mention your name, by the by. Joe mentioned it now, and the strange man called him by it. "What will you drink, Mr. Gargery, at my expense, to top up with?" Joe Gargery. "Well," said Joe, "to tell you the truth, I ain't much in the habit of drinking at anybody's expense but my own." "Habit? No," returned the stranger. "But once in a way, and on a Saturday night too. Come, put a name to it, Mr. Gargery." "I won't wish to be stiff company," said Joe. "Rum." "Rum," repeated the stranger. "And will the other gentleman originate the sentiment?" "Rum," said Mr. Wopsle. "3 rums," cried the stranger, calling to the landlord. "Glasses round." "This other gentleman," observed Joe, by way of introducing Mr. Wopsle, "is a gentleman that you would like to hear give it out, our clerk at church." "Aha!" said the stranger quickly and cocking his eye at me. "The lonely church, right out in the marshes, with graves round it." "That's it," said Joe. The stranger, with a comfortable kind of grunt over his pipe, put his legs up on the saddle that he had to himself. He wore a flapping, broad-brimmed traveller's hat, and under it a handkerchief tied over his head in the manner of a cap, so that he showed no hair. As he looked at the fire, I thought I saw a cunning expression, followed by a half-laugh, come into his face. "I'm not acquainted with this country, gentlemen, but it seems a solitary country towards the river." "Most marshes is solitary," said Joe. No doubt. Do you find any gypsies now, or tramps, or vagrants, or any sort out there?" "No," said Joe. "None by a runaway convict now and then, and we don't find them easy." "Eh, Mr. Wopsle?" Mr. Wopsle, with a majestic remembrance of old discomfiture, assented, but not warmly. "Seems you have been out after such?" asked the stranger. "Once," returned Joe. "Not that we wanted to take them, you understand. We went out as lookers-on, me and Mr. Wopsle and Pip. Didn't us, Pip?" "Yes, Joe." The stranger looked at me again, still cocking his eye, as if he were expressing taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and said, "He's a likely young parcel of bones, that. What is it you call him?" "Pip," said Joe. "Christianed Pip?" "No, not christianed Pip." "Surname Pip?" "No," said Joe. "It's a kind of family name that he gave himself when an infant and is called by." "Son of yours?" "Well," said Joe meditatively, not, of course, that it could be in any wise necessary to consider about it, but because it was the way at the Jolly Jolly Bargeman to seem to consider deeply about everything that was discussed over pipes. "Well, no, he ain't." "Nevy?" said the strange man. "Well," said Joe, with the same appearance of profound cogitation, "he is not, no, not to deceive you, he is not my nevy." "What the blue blaze is he?" asked the stranger, which appeared to me to be an inquiry of unnecessary strength. Mr. Wopsle struck in upon that, as one who knew all about relationships, having professional occasion to bear in mind what female relations to men might not marry, and expounded the ties between me and Joe. Having his hand on, Mr. Wopsle finished off with a most terrifically snarling passage from Richard III, and seemed to think he had done quite enough to account for it when he added, as the poets say. And here I may remark that when Mr. Wopsle referred to me, he considered it a necessary part of such reference to rumple my hair and poke into my eyes. I cannot conceive why everybody of his standing who visited at our house should always have put me through the same inflammatory process under similar circumstances. Yet I do not call to mind that I was ever in my earlier youth the subject of remark in our social family circle, but some large-handed person took some such ophthalmic steps to patronize me. All this while, The strange man looked at nobody but me, and looked at me as if he were determined to have a shot at me at last and bringing me down. But he said nothing after offering his blue blazes observation until the glasses of rum and water were brought, and then he made his shot, and a most extraordinary shot it was. It was not a verbal remark, but a proceeding in dumb show, and was pointed addressed to me. He stirred his rum and water pointedly at me, and he tasted his rum and water pointedly at me, and he stirred it and he tasted it, not with a spoon that was brought to him, but with a file. He did this so that nobody but I saw the file, and when he had done it, he wiped the file and put it in the breast pocket. I knew it to be Joe's file, and I knew that he knew my convict the moment I saw the instrument. I sat gazing at him, spellbound, but he now reclined on his settle, taking very little notice of me, and talking principally about turnips. There was a delicious sense of cleaning up and making a quiet pause before going on in life afresh in our village on Saturday nights, which stimulated Joe to dare stay out half an hour longer on Saturdays than at other times. The half hour and the rum and water running out together, Joe got up to go and took me by the hand. "Stop half a moment, Mr. Gargery," said the strange man. "I think I've got a bright new shilling somewhere in my pocket, and if I have, the boy shall have it." He took it out from a handful of small change, folded it in some crumpled paper, and gave it to me. "Yours," said he. "Mine, your own." I thanked him, staring at him far beyond the bounds of good manners, and holding tight to Joe. He gave Joe good night, and he gave Mr. Wopsle good night, and he gave me only a look with his aiming eye. Not a look, for he shut it up, but wonders may be done with an eye by hiding it. On the way home, if I had been in the humor for talking, the talk must have been all on my side. For Mr. Wopsle parted from us at the door of the Jolly Bargeman, and Joe went all the way home with his mouth wide open to rinse the rum out with as much air as possible. But I was in a manner stupefied by this turning up of my old misdeed and old acquaintance, and could think of nothing else. 即係呢個 stranger 其實係邊個啊？個 convict 咯，即係原來個 convict 冇俾人捉到上船喎，somehow佢又走咗出嚟喎。因為佢一路啤住阿 Pip 啊嘛，好奇怪。然之後佢 show 俾阿 Pip 睇佢個 file 啊嘛，佢個 file 就係佢俾佢噶嘛。然之後佢就俾個 shilling 俾阿 Pip， 然之後佢就Joe 就即刻的佢走啦。咁即係阿 Joe 都認得呢個人，但係一開始認唔到佢，因為佢而家 clean up 咗啦嘛，係啊，明唔明啊？但係唔知點解喎，我唔明點解呢個角色咁快又出現翻喎，係啦。My sister was not in a very bad temper when we presented ourselves in the kitchen, and Joe was encouraged by that unusual circumstance to tell her about the bright shilling. "Abaddon, I'm be bound," said Mrs. Joe triumphantly, "or he would have given it to the boy. Let's look at it." I took it out of the paper, and it proved to be a good one. "But what's this?" said Mrs. Joe, throwing down the shilling and catching up the paper. "2 1-pound notes?" Nothing less than 2 fat, sweltering 1-pound notes that seemed to have been on terms of the warmest intimacy with all the cattle markets in the county. Joe caught up his hat again and ran with them to the Jolly Bargeman to restore them to their owner. While he was gone, I sat down on my usual stool and looked vacantly at my sister, feeling pretty sure that the man would not be there. Presently, Joe came back, saying that the man was gone, but that he, Joe, had left word at the 3 Jolly Bargemen concerning the notes. Then my sister sealed them up in a piece of paper and put them under some dried rose leaves in an ornamental teapot on the top of a press in the state parlour. There they remained, a nightmare to me, many and many a night and day. 即係2張 1-pound note， 咁我唔知啦。我唔知點解嗰2張 1-pound note 要搞到佢哋咁緊張啊，Joe要即刻俾翻佢。I had sadly broken sleep when I got to bed, through thinking of the strange man taking aim at me with his invisible gun, and of the guilty cause and common thing it was to be on secret terms of conspiracy with convicts, a feature in my law career that I had previously forgotten. I was haunted by the file too. A dread possessed me that when I least expected it, the file would reappear. I coaxed myself to sleep by thinking of Miss Havisham's next Wednesday, and in my sleep, I saw the file coming at me out of a door without seeing who held it, and I screamed myself awake. 即係 Pip 似乎佢唔開心係咩？就係佢覺得，即係佢想做上等人啊嘛。咁但係我又同呢啲咁樣嘅逃犯扯上關係，你明白？覺得佢自己好不幸咯。然之後佢又諗起嗰個 file 嗰個錯啊，佢覺得好恐怖啊，好恐怖。即係諗起個 file 佢就覺得係唔好嘅嘢。咁但係其實實際上人哋都叫做俾翻啲酬勞你啦。雖然我唔知點解佢哋覺得嗰啲酬勞咁恐怖，係咯。咁但係就可能佢哋唔想要嗰啲錢定點？唔想扯上關係。係唔想扯上關係。咁咯。我好意外咯，咁快呢個角色出現翻。咁其實如果呢個角色 clean up 咗做翻 common people 啊，咁佢應該會繼續出現。我估啦，係咯。咁然之後佢又再提一提就係要下個禮拜去邊度啊？
去嗰個女人。
Miss Havisham 屋企啦，係啦，就係咁咯。咁而家故事有少少雙線發展喎，又有呢個 有個 convict， 又有 Miss Havisham， 就係咁咯，好嗎？好啦，我哋下個禮拜繼續講。拜拜。